Uncle Richard's funeral was held on a gray Tuesday in October, the kind of day where the sky pressed down low and heavy, threatening rain that never quite came but hung in the air as humidity and oppressive stillness. The church was full, not because Uncle Richard had been particularly beloved by the community, but because he'd been wealthy, and wealthy people's funerals always drew crowds, business associates who wanted to be seen, society types who treated every major life event as a networking opportunity. Distant relatives who'd barely spoken to him in decades but showed up now, dressed in expensive black, wearing expressions of practiced grief. I sat in the third row, between my mother and my younger sister Emma, trying to focus on the eulogies and failing. My mind kept wandering to the last conversation I'd had with Uncle Richard 3 weeks before he died. He'd been in the hospital then, his liver finally giving up after decades of what he'd cheerfully called enthusiastic living and what everyone else called alcoholism. I'd visited him every day for the 2 weeks he'd been there, bringing him books he didn't read and keeping him company while the rest of the family sent flowers and cards but rarely appeared in person. "You're a good kid, Jordan," he'd said during that last visit, his voice thin and raspy from the breathing tube they'd had in earlier that week. "Always have been. The only one in this family who gives a damn about people rather than what people can do for you." "Don't talk like that," I'd said, adjusting his pillow for the third time because I needed something to do with my hands. "You're going to get out of here. You're too stubborn to die." He'd laughed, which had turned into coughing, which had required several minutes and a nurse's intervention to get under control. When he could breathe again, he'd looked at me with eyes that were too clear, too knowing. "I'm dying, Jordan. We both know it, and I'm okay with that. I've lived a long time, done what I wanted to do, and now I'm tired. But I need you to know something." "What?" "That you matter. That your kindness matters. That the way you show up for people matters. Even when, especially when, nobody else does. Don't let them make you feel like it doesn't. Don't let them make you feel like you're less than because you're good." I hadn't understood what he meant at the time. Sitting in that church, watching my cousin Ryan give a eulogy that was more about Ryan's successful real estate business than about Uncle Richard, I was starting to figure it out. The family had always treated me as the odd one out, the weirdo who'd chosen to be a social worker instead of going into business or finance like every other Morrison for 3 generations. The bleeding heart who worked 60-hour weeks for $45,000 a year when I could have been making 6 figures like my cousins. The disappointment who'd turned down Uncle Richard's offer to fund my MB and join him in commercial real estate, choosing instead to get a master's in social work and take a job at a nonprofit helping homeless youth. They didn't understand me. Worse, they didn't try to understand me. They just wrote me off as naive, impractical, too soft for the real world. And over the years, as I'd chosen my work over family events, as I'd missed holidays because I was covering crisis shifts, as I'd shown up to gatherings exhausted and underdressed because I'd come straight from work, they'd stopped hiding their disappointment and moved into active disdain. Ryan finished his eulogy to polite applause and returned to his seat in the front row. He was Uncle Richard's oldest nephew, son of Richard's sister, Margaret, and he'd positioned himself as the heir apparent to both the family business and the family's social standing. Ryan was 35, unmarried, drove a Porsche, lived in a penthouse downtown, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone how successful he was. He'd barely visited Uncle Richard in the hospital. Too busy closing deals, he'd said, too busy building his empire. That my cousin Victoria went next, Richard's niece from his brother's side. She gave a tearful speech about what a wonderful uncle he'd been, how generous and kind and supportive. I'd seen her visit the hospital exactly once, staying for 15 minutes before claiming she had a charity gala to attend. Her speech was beautifully delivered. Victoria had done theater in college, but it felt hollow to me, performed rather than felt. Then my cousin Marcus, then my Aunt Patricia, then several business associates whose names I didn't remember. Each speech followed the same pattern: brief acknowledgement of Uncle Richard's death, followed by extended discussion of his business acumen, his success, his ability to make things happen. Nobody mentioned his sense of humor, his love of terrible puns, his habit of calling me at 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep during his final months, wanting to hear about my work, about the kids I helped, about anything other than his own mortality. Finally, the minister invited people to share final memories. There was an awkward silence. The formal eulogies had been assigned in advance, but this was open participation, and nobody quite wanted to go first. I stood up. I hadn't planned to speak, hadn't prepared anything, but suddenly I couldn't sit there anymore listening to people who'd barely known Uncle Richard talk about him like he'd been nothing but a bank account with a pulse. "Uncle Richard called me 2 days before he died," I said, my voice shaking slightly but steady enough. "He told me about the time when I was 7 and I brought a stray cat home and begged my parents to let me keep it. They said no, that we couldn't afford a pet. that it was irresponsible. Uncle Richard showed up the next day with cat food and a litter box and told my parents that if they wouldn't take care of it, he would, but that kids needed to learn compassion and responsibility, and saying no to both was doing me a disservice. I could see my mother shifting uncomfortably in her seat. We'd never talked about this. She'd been embarrassed by Richard's intervention, had spent years subtly implying that he'd overstepped. We kept the cat, I continued. Her name was Toast, because she was orange, and she lived to be 19. Uncle Richard paid for her vet bills without ever mentioning it. I only found out years later when I was going through some old files and saw the receipts. That was who he was, someone who showed up for people, who taught by example rather than lecture, who believed that kindness mattered more than profit. I sat down to scattered applause that sounded uncertain, like people weren't quite sure if that had been appropriate. Ryan was staring at me with an expression I couldn't read. Victoria looked annoyed. Marcus seemed bored. The service ended. People filed out to the cemetery for the burial, a processional of black cars and false solemnity. I rode with my mother and Emma, neither of whom said anything about my eulogy. The silence felt heavy with things unsaid. At the graveside, we stood in a semicircle around the casket while the minister said final prayers. The crowd was smaller here, only family and close friends, about 40 people compared to the 200 who'd been at the church. I stood at the back, trying to be invisible. That's when Ryan found me. "Nice speech in there," he said, and his tone made it clear he hadn't thought it was nice at all. Really touching, bringing up a cat story at a funeral. Very appropriate. It was a story about who Uncle Richard was as a person, I said quietly. I thought that was the point of a eulogy. The point of a eulogy is to honor someone's legacy, their accomplishments, what they built, not some sentimental nonsense about a cat from 20 years ago. He moved closer, lowering his voice so others wouldn't hear. "You know what your problem is, Jordan? You've never understood what matters. You waste your life on people who can't help themselves, working some poverty wage job, acting like you're some kind of saint. Meanwhile, those of us who actually contribute to society, who actually build things and create value, have to watch you embarrass the family with your bleeding heart nonsense." "I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I'm just trying to help people." "You're useless," Ryan said flatly. "You always have been. You're the family charity case, the one we all have to pretend to respect even though you've accomplished nothing. And you know what? It's fitting that you showed up here to mourn Uncle Richard because you're going to inherit exactly what you deserve from him. Nothing. Just like you've earned nothing in your life." Before I could respond, he walked away, rejoining Victoria and Marcus near the front of the crowd. I saw them talking, saw Victoria glance back at me and laugh at something Ryan said. I felt my face burning. The worst part was that some of what Ryan said echoed thoughts I'd had myself in my darker moments. Was I wasting my life? Was I making a difference? Or was I just spinning my wheels, trying to fix problems that were too big for any one person to solve? The kids I worked with had such massive systemic barriers: poverty, addiction, abuse, mental illness, a social safety net with so many holes that people fell through constantly. I helped where I could, but for every kid I helped get into housing or school or treatment, there were 10 more who I couldn't reach, couldn't help, couldn't save. Maybe Ryan was right. Maybe I was useless. Maybe I had accomplished nothing. My mother appeared at my elbow. "Don't listen to Ryan. He's always been an ass." "He's not wrong, though. I haven't exactly set the world on fire." "You help people. That matters." "Does it? Sometimes I'm not sure anymore." She squeezed my hand once, and we stood together watching them lower Uncle Richard's casket into the ground. The minister said something about ashes to ashes, dust to dust. People threw flowers onto the casket. Someone was crying, Aunt Margaret probably, though I couldn't see clearly through the crowd. And then it was over. The funeral concluded. The crowd began to disperse, heading back to cars, discussing lunch plans and afternoon schedules, already moving on with their lives. "There's a will reading at 3 o'clock, my mother said, at Uncle Richard's attorney's office. We're all expected to attend." "Why? It's not like I'm getting anything." Ryan made that pretty clear. "Richard's attorney specifically requested that all family members attend, so we're attending." I almost argued, almost said I'd rather just go home and try to process everything. But the look on my mother's face suggested this wasn't negotiable, so I nodded. "Fine, I'll be there." The law offices of Patterson, Chen, and Associates occupied the entire 23rd floor of a downtown high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the city skyline. The reception area was all sleek modern furniture and contemporary art, the kind of space designed to communicate both wealth and taste. A receptionist who looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine directed us to a large conference room down the hall. The room was already half full when we arrived. Long table in the center, 20 chairs around it, crystal water glasses at each place setting. Ryan was there, talking on his phone in a way that suggested he wanted everyone to know he was fielding important business calls even during a family gathering. Victoria was there with her husband Preston, both of them looking impatient, like they had somewhere better to be. Marcus was there with his wife and their teenage daughter. Various aunts and uncles I saw once or twice a year. My mother's brother Daniel and his wife, Uncle Richard's sister Margaret and her husband. We took seats toward the middle of the table. Emma immediately pulled out her phone and started scrolling, her way of dealing with family stress. My mother smoothed her skirt and maintained the composed expression she always wore at family functions, the one that said she was above all this drama even when she definitely wasn't. At exactly 3 o'clock, the door opened and a woman in her 60s walked in. She was tall, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. She moved with the kind of confidence that came from decades of commanding courtrooms and conference rooms. "Good afternoon. I'm Patricia Chen, senior partner here at Patterson, Chen & Associates. I had the privilege of serving as Richard Morrison's attorney for the past 20 years. I've asked you all here today for the reading of Mr. Morrison's will. Per his explicit instructions, all family members were required to be present for this reading, so I appreciate you all making the time." She pulled a leather folder from her briefcase and set it on the table. "Before we begin, I need to clarify something. Mr. Morrison's estate is substantial. His various business holdings, real estate investments, stock portfolios, and other assets have been professionally appraised at approximately $47 million. This does not include several properties that will be handled separately, which would bring the total closer to $52 million. A murmur ran through the room. I'd known Uncle Richard was wealthy. You couldn't not know, given his lifestyle, but I hadn't realized quite how wealthy. $52 million was an almost incomprehensible amount of money. Ryan was practically vibrating in his seat. Victoria had sat up straighter, all traces of impatience gone. Marcus was doing mental math, probably calculating what his share might be. Even my mother looked interested, leaning forward slightly to hear better. "The distribution of Mr. Morrison's estate is unconventional," Patricia continued. "He spent considerable time revising and updating his will over the past year, particularly during his final illness. He was very specific about his wishes, and he made it clear that these wishes were to be honored exactly as written, regardless of any objections from family members." Of course," Ryan said, waving his hand dismissively. "Uncle Richard was always particular about details. That's what made him such a successful businessman. I'm sure whatever he's arranged is perfectly reasonable." Patricia looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd dealt with entitled assholes before and wasn't impressed. "I'll begin with the specific bequests, and then move to the residuary estate. Let's start with personal items." She opened the folder and began reading. "To my sister Margaret Morrison Reed, I leave my collection of first edition mystery novels, which she always admired. To my brother Daniel Morrison, I leave my vintage watch collection, which he helped me begin decades ago. To my niece Emma Morrison, I leave my grandmother's jewelry, which I believe she will appreciate and care for appropriately." Emma looked up from her phone, surprised. "Really?" "Really," Patricia confirmed. "Mr. Morrison noted in his will that you were the only family member who ever asked about his grandmother, who took the time to listen to family stories. He wanted you to have something meaningful." My mother squeezed Emma's hand. Emma looked like she might cry. Patricia continued through a list of personal bequests, specific items to specific people, clearly chosen with care, a painting to one cousin who'd admired it, a set of golf clubs to an old friend, books, artwork, furniture, all distributed with obvious thought. "Now," Patricia said, "we move to the monetary distributions." The room went completely silent. This was what everyone had been waiting for. This was why they were all here, barely suppressing their excitement. "To my niece Victoria Morrison Hayes, I leave the sum of $0. The silence deepened, became sharp. Victoria's face went white. "What?" "To my nephew Marcus Morrison, I leave the sum of $0. "There must be a mistake," Marcus said, but his voice had gone thin. "To my nephew Ryan Morrison, I leave the sum of $0. Ryan stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a bang that made several people jump. His face had gone from its normal color to an alarming shade of red, the kind of red that suggested his blood pressure had just spiked into dangerous territory. "That's impossible. That can't be right. There has to be some mistake. I'm his closest nephew, his business partner for the past 5 years, his protege in real estate development, the one who—" "Sit down, Mr. Morrison," Patricia said, and her voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades in courtrooms dealing with people who thought they were above the rules. It was a voice that made Ryan sit down immediately despite his obvious rage, despite the fact that every muscle in his body was tensed for a fight. "I'm not finished, and if you interrupt me again, I'll have you removed from this room and you'll receive the remainder of the will reading via certified mail. Do you understand?" Ryan's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath his skin, but he nodded once, sharply. Patricia continued down the list, her voice steady and professional, reading each name with the same clinical precision. Aunt after aunt, uncle after uncle, cousin after cousin. Every single one received the same thing, $0. $0 to Aunt Margaret, who'd helped raise Uncle Richard after their parents died. $0 to Uncle Daniel, who'd been Richard's business partner in the early days. $0 to Cousin Victoria, who'd been named after Richard's mother. $0 to Cousin Marcus, who'd gone into real estate specifically to follow in Richard's footsteps. 0, 0, 0, 0. With each pronouncement, the tension in the room ratcheted higher. People were gripping armrests, faces were going white, then red, then back to white again. Someone was hyperventilating, I think it was Aunt Patricia. Someone else was making small wounded sounds in the back of their throat. Victoria had pulled out her phone and was frantically typing something, probably texting her husband who'd stayed home with the kids. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick, his hand pressed against his mouth, his eyes wide and unfocused. The room erupted before Patricia could even finish the list. People talking over each other, voices rising in pitch and volume, accusations flying across the table like weapons. Someone knocked over a water glass and nobody bothered to clean it up, the water spreading across the expensive wood table in a growing puddle that nobody noticed because everyone was too busy having their own personal crisis. "There must be a mistake." That was Aunt Margaret, her voice shrill with panic. "Richard wouldn't cut out his entire family. He loved us. He called me every Sunday. He came to my house for holidays." "He came to your house because you guilted him into it," Victoria shot back, apparently deciding that if she wasn't getting money, she might as well be honest. "He told me once that your Sunday calls were exhausting, that you only called to complain about your life and ask for advice you never took." "How dare you?" "This has to be illegal," Marcus interrupted, standing up and pointing at Patricia like she was personally responsible for his disappointment. "You can't just cut out an entire family from an inheritance. There are laws about this. There are rules about equitable distribution." "Mr. Morrison, I'm an estate attorney with 25 years of experience. I'm very familiar with inheritance law, and I can assure you this will is completely legal and enforceable." Patricia's voice could have cut glass. "If you'd like to contest it, you're welcome to hire your own attorney and try. You'll lose, but you're welcome to try." "We'll sue you too," Ryan said, apparently deciding that threats were his best option since reasoning wasn't working. "For malpractice. For allowing him to make this decision. You should have known he wasn't thinking clearly." "Mr. Morrison, if you threaten me again, I will have you removed from this building immediately. And for the record, your uncle was evaluated by 2 independent psychiatrists who both certified he was of sound mind. Both evaluations are notarized and part of the official court record. Any judge will see them before they see any challenge you file. You will lose." Someone was crying now. Loud, ugly sobs that filled the room. I realized with a start that it was Uncle Daniel, a man I'd never seen show emotion in my entire life. He was slumped in his chair, his face in his hands, shoulders shaking. 40 years, he was saying between sobs. 40 years of friendship, of partnership, of brotherhood. And this is what it comes to. Nothing. We get nothing. "You get what you gave," Patricia said, and there was something almost sad in her voice now, some recognition of the tragedy playing out in front of her. Mr. Morrison was very clear about his reasoning. He felt that most of you treated him as a bank account rather than as a person, that you showed up when you wanted something and disappeared when you didn't, that you measured your relationship with him in terms of what he could provide rather than who he was. "That's not true." Aunt Margaret was on her feet now too, pointing at Patricia with a shaking finger. "We loved Richard. We were family. You can't just dismiss decades of family relationships because of some twisted interpretation." "I'm not dismissing anything. I'm reading the will as written. Your brother made these choices himself. Perhaps instead of being angry at me for executing his wishes, you should consider why he made these wishes in the first place." The room had devolved into complete chaos now. Multiple conversations happening simultaneously, people yelling over each other, accusations and recriminations flying in every direction. Victoria was crying while simultaneously trying to call her husband. Marcus had his own phone out and was already pulling up the contact information for what I assumed was his lawyer. Ryan was pacing at the back of the room like a caged animal, his hands clenched into fists, muttering to himself about fairness and justice and lawsuits. And through all of it, I sat frozen in my chair, unable to process what was happening, unable to believe this was real. This couldn't be real. People didn't actually cut their entire family out of their wills. People didn't leave $52 million to a single nephew who barely made enough to cover rent. This was something from a movie, not something that happened in actual life. There must be a mistake, my mother said again, and she'd moved beyond shock into what looked like genuine grief. Her voice was hollow, distant, like she was speaking from very far away. Richard wouldn't cut out his entire family. He loved us. There must have been some mistake, some misunderstanding, There is no mistake, Patricia said, raising her voice to be heard over the chaos. And Mr. Morrison didn't cut out his entire family. I have one more bequest to read. The room went quiet with an abruptness that was almost violent. The silence was so complete I could hear the air conditioning system humming overhead, could hear someone's phone buzzing with notifications, could hear my own heart pounding in my chest so hard I thought everyone must be able to hear it. Everyone was looking around now, trying to figure out who hadn't been named yet. I saw Ryan's eyes land on me, saw his expression shift from confusion to suspicion to something that looked almost like fear. I saw Victoria make the same connection, her eyes widening, her hand going to her mouth. I saw Marcus's face darken with understanding and something that looked like rage, pure and undiluted. To my nephew Jordan Morrison, Patricia read, I leave the entirety of my residual estate, including all business holdings, real estate properties, investment portfolios, bank accounts, and any other assets not specifically bequeathed above. This includes approximately $47 million in liquid and business assets, plus the 4 commercial properties held separately in trust, valued at approximately $5 million. Total bequest, $52 million. The silence was absolute. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Every eye in the room was on me. I felt like the floor had disappeared beneath my chair. I'm sorry, what? You inherit everything, Patricia said, looking at me directly. Your uncle left you his entire estate, minus the few personal bequests I've already mentioned. But that's not... I couldn't form complete sentences. $52 million. That was more money than I could conceptually understand. That was more money than I'd earn in multiple lifetimes doing the work I did. That was impossible. Why? I finally managed. Why would he do that? Patricia pulled out another sheet of paper. Mr. Morrison included a letter to be read aloud after the bequests. Would you like me to read it? I nodded, not trusting my voice. She cleared her throat and began to read Uncle Richard's words. To my family, if you're hearing this, then I'm dead, which is probably a relief to most of you who've been waiting for years for this moment so you could get your hands on my money. Sorry to disappoint. I've left my entire estate to Jordan for a simple reason. They're the only one of you who gave a damn about me as a person, rather than as a bank account. In the last 2 months of my life, Jordan visited me in the hospital every single day, sat with me, read to me, talked with me about things that mattered. The rest of you sent flowers and cards and made occasional brief appearances so you could tell yourselves you'd done your duty. Jordan is also the only one of you who spent their life actually helping people instead of just accumulating wealth and pretending that makes you important. They work with homeless kids, making poverty wages, genuinely trying to make the world less terrible. Meanwhile, the rest of you have spent your lives chasing money and status, treating anyone without either as beneath you, including Jordan. I've watched you dismiss Jordan for years. I've watched you mock their career choice, belittle their accomplishments, treat them like the family embarrassment because they chose compassion over profit. And I've watched Jordan continue to show up, continue to be kind, continue to help people who can't help them in return, despite having a family that doesn't value or appreciate them. So I'm leaving everything to Jordan, not because I think money will make them happy. They're already happier than any of you precisely because they don't measure their worth by their bank account, but because they'll actually use it to help people, because they'll do something meaningful with it, and because all of you need to learn that there are consequences to treating people like they don't matter. To Jordan, I'm sorry to burden you with this. I know you didn't want it and don't need it, but I trust you to do something good with it. And I hope it gives you the freedom to help even more people, to expand your work, to make the difference you've always wanted to make. You're the best person I know, kid. Don't let them make you doubt that. To everyone else, you're welcome to contest this will, but I've made sure it's airtight. Patricia is one of the best estate lawyers in the state, and we've spent months making this bulletproof. You won't win. I suggest you take this as an opportunity to examine your own choices and priorities instead. With love and disappointment, in roughly equal measure, Richard Morrison. Patricia set down the letter. The silence in the room had changed quality, from shock to fury. I could feel the anger rolling off my relatives in waves. "This is bullshit," Ryan said, standing up again. "Complete bullshit." He was clearly not in his right mind at the end. Medications, pain. He wasn't thinking clearly. "Mr. Morrison was evaluated by 2 independent psychiatrists during the drafting of this will," Patricia interrupted. "Both certified that he was of sound mind and fully understood the implications of his decisions. Both evaluations are part of the official record. Any attempt to contest based on mental competency will fail." "Undue influence, then," Victoria said, her voice shaking with rage as she pointed at me. "Jordan was there every day, manipulating him, poisoning him against the rest of us. I did no such thing," I finally found my voice. "I never asked Uncle Richard for anything. I didn't even know he was planning this." "Liar," Marcus said flatly. "You conned him, played the devoted nephew, pretended to care. Also, you could steal his money from his actual family." "That's not what happened." "Prove it," Ryan challenged. "Prove you didn't manipulate him." "The burden of proof is on you, Mr. Morrison," Patricia said coldly, "and you'll find it impossible to meet." Mr. Morrison kept journals during his final months. Every conversation, every visit, everything is documented, including detailed notes about visits from other family members. The court will find it very interesting that Jordan visited daily for 2 months, while the rest of you averaged 1 visit per week at most, and several of you didn't visit at all until the final week. My mother had been silent through all of this, but now she spoke. "Jordan, did you know Richard was going to do this?" "No. I swear, Mom, I had no idea. I never asked him for money, never even hinted at it. I just visited because he was sick and alone, and I wanted to help." She looked at me for a long moment, and I couldn't read her expression. Then she stood up. "I believe you. Richard was a difficult man in many ways, but he was also the best judge of character I've ever known. If he thought you deserved this, then you deserve it." "Mom," I started, but she was already walking toward the door. "I need some air. Emma, come with me." Emma scrambled up and followed our mother out. That seemed to break whatever spell had been holding the room, and suddenly everyone was moving, talking, yelling. Aunt Margaret was crying. Uncle Daniel was arguing with Ryan about whether they should pool resources to contest the will. Victoria was on her phone, presumably calling lawyers. Patricia caught my eye and gestured toward a side door. I followed her out of the conference room, down a hallway, and into a smaller office. She closed the door, muffling the chaos from the conference room. "That went about as well as expected," she said dryly. "Richard predicted this reaction almost exactly." "Why didn't he warn me?" I asked, still feeling like I was in shock, like this was happening to someone else. "Why would he just blindside me like this?" "Because if he'd told you in advance, you would have tried to talk him out of it. Knowing you, you would have argued that you didn't need the money, that the family deserved it more, that you couldn't possibly accept it. Am I wrong?" I thought about it. "No, you're not wrong. Richard knew that about you. That's why he did it this way." She walked to her desk and pulled out another folder. "This is for you. More documentation, including the journals I mentioned, instructions for accessing various accounts, contact information for the financial advisors, property managers, and other professionals who've been handling Richard's affairs, and a private letter from Richard to you, which I was instructed to give you away from the others." She handed me the folder. It was heavy, full of papers that represented a life's worth of accumulated wealth now suddenly mine. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked quietly. "Whatever you want. It's yours now. Richard put no restrictions on it, no conditions. He trusted you to use it wisely, but the choice is entirely yours." "They're going to hate me. The family. They already do. But now it's going to be so much worse." "Probably," Patricia agreed. "But you know what Richard told me when we were finalizing the will? He said, they already don't value Jordan. At least this way Jordan gets something out of their dismissal." She smiled slightly. "He was a difficult client in many ways, but I liked him. He saw people clearly." There was a knock on the door. Patricia's assistant stuck her head in. "Ms. Chen, Mr. Ryan Morrison is demanding to speak with you. He's threatening legal action if you don't. Tell Mr. Morrison that I'm done speaking with the family for today. Any further communication should go through his attorney to mine, and have building security ready in case he needs escorting out." The assistant nodded and disappeared. Patricia turned back to me. "I'm going to give you my direct number. You're going to need support over the next few weeks while this all settles. The family will come after you, not just legally, though there will be that too, but emotionally. They'll try to guilt you, manipulate you, maybe even threaten you. You need to be prepared for that. How do I prepare for my entire family turning against me? By remembering why Richard did this, by remembering that their anger is their problem, not yours. By using this gift to do exactly what Richard believed you would do with it, help people who actually need help. She handed me a business card. Call me if you need anything, legal advice, emotional support, whatever. Richard made me promise to look after you, and I take my promises seriously. I left through a private exit, avoiding the family members still arguing in the conference room. My phone was already buzzing with messages, some from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, some from the cousins who'd been at the reading. I didn't read any of them. I just drove home in a daze, parked in my apartment complex's lot, and sat there for 30 minutes trying to process what had just happened. I'd gone to a funeral this morning as the family disappointment, the bleeding heart with the poverty wage job, and the embarrassing career choices. I'd been told I was useless, that I'd inherit nothing, that I'd accomplish nothing. Now I was worth $52 million, and the family that had dismissed me for years wanted me to share it with them. The question was, what the hell was I going to do about it? The next 72 hours were chaos. I'd turned off my phone after the first 100 texts and calls, but that didn't stop people from finding other ways to reach me. They showed up at my apartment, they sent emails, they contacted my workplace, they left handwritten notes on my car. The messages varied in tone but were consistent in content. I needed to share the inheritance, I needed to be reasonable, I needed to remember that we were family. I needed to understand that Uncle Richard hadn't really meant to exclude them, that he'd been sick and medicated and not thinking clearly, that I had a moral obligation to do the right thing. Ryan's message, delivered via a 10-page letter slipped under my apartment door, was particularly creative. He'd outlined a proposal where I would keep $5 million for myself, more than generous for someone who's never built anything, and distribute the remaining $47 million to the family based on some complex formula he'd devised that coincidentally allocated the largest share to himself. He'd included spreadsheets and charts and a whole financial analysis of why this was the fair solution. The letter ended with a thinly veiled threat about how contesting the will would be expensive and time-consuming for everyone, but if I didn't agree to his proposal, he'd have no choice but to pursue all legal options. Victoria's approach was more emotional. She'd sent me a 5-minute voice message crying about how she had children to think about, how they needed their inheritance to secure their futures. How could I be so selfish as to take everything when she needed help? Never mind that Victoria's husband was a surgeon and they lived in a house worth $2 million. Never mind that her need was really just a desire to maintain a lifestyle that was already comfortable. Marcus didn't bother with appeals to fairness or emotion. His message was simple. This isn't over. We're contesting the will. You'll be hearing from our lawyers. The only family member who didn't reach out was my mother. She'd called once, the morning after the reading, but when I'd answered, she'd just said, "I wanted to make sure you're okay. Are you okay?" I'd said I didn't know, and she'd said, "Okay, call me when you're ready to talk," and hung up. That was it. No demands, no manipulations, no judgment, just checking in. Emma had sent one text. "Holy shit, you okay?" I'd replied, "Not really," and she'd sent back a string of heart emojis and "I'm here if you need me." By the third day, I'd read through all the documents Patricia had given me. The journals were particularly painful, Uncle Richard's detailed accounts of his final months, noting who visited and who didn't, what people said, and how they behaved. There were entries about Ryan showing up once in week 3, staying for 15 minutes, and spending most of that time talking about a property deal he was working on. Entries about Victoria visiting in week 5 and spending the entire time complaining about her marriage. Entries about various other relatives who'd appeared briefly, paid their respects, and disappeared. And then there were entries about me. Pages and pages about our conversations, about how I'd brought him audiobooks of his favorite mystery novels, about how I'd listened to stories about his childhood, about my grandmother who died before I was born, about his regrets and hopes and fears, about how I'd sat with him during the bad nights when the pain was unbearable and he couldn't sleep, just being present, not trying to fix anything, just being there. "Jordan doesn't realize how rare they are," one entry read. "They don't understand that most people only show up when they want something or when it's convenient. Jordan shows up because they care, that's it. That's the whole reason. They just care about people, even people who can't do anything for them in return. I wish I'd been more like that when I was younger. Maybe I'd have fewer regrets." Reading those entries, I understood for the first time why he'd done this. It wasn't really about the money. It was about making a statement, about showing the family that their values were wrong, that their priorities were backwards, that they'd been looking down on the one person who actually embodied what family should mean. The private letter Patricia had given me said essentially the same thing. Jordan, if you're reading this, then Patricia has done her job and you're now the confused, overwhelmed owner of my entire estate. Sorry about that. I know you didn't want this. I know you probably tried to refuse it or give it back somehow. But here's the thing. I didn't leave you this money because I thought you needed it or wanted it. I left it to you because you'll use it right. Not for yourself, you've never been that kind of person, but for the work you do, for the kids you help, for making the world less shitty in whatever way you can. I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion for years, trying to help people with no resources, no support, no recognition. I've watched you pour your heart into kids who society has written off, trying to give them a chance when nobody else will. And I've watched you do it for poverty wages while people like Ryan get rich exploiting loopholes and playing financial games that help nobody but themselves. You've always had the better understanding of what matters, Jordan. The rest of the family thinks success means money and status. You understand that success means helping people, that it means showing up, that it means giving a damn about something other than your own comfort. So here's what I'm asking you to do with this money. Expand your work. Build something bigger. Create programs that actually help people on a scale that matters. Hire staff, buy buildings, fund initiatives that give kids like the ones you work with a real chance. Do what you've always wanted to do but couldn't because you didn't have resources. And yes, take care of yourself too. Buy a decent car that doesn't break down every other month. Get a place to live where you're not scared someone's going to break in. Take a vacation. For God's sake, take a vacation. You've been running on fumes for years. The family is going to lose their minds about this. They're going to come after you with everything they've got. Don't give in. Don't let them guilt you into sharing what you don't owe them. They had chances to be decent people, to value the right things, to treat you with respect. They chose not to. That's on them. You're the best person I know, Jordan. I'm proud of you. Use this money to do something that would make me proud, too. Love always. Uncle Richard? I read that letter 3 times, sitting in my crappy apartment with its cracked ceiling and temperamental heating, and cried. Not because of the money, though that was overwhelming, but because Uncle Richard had seen me, had valued me, had understood what I was trying to do even when nobody else did. On the 4th day, I called Patricia Chen. Jordan, she answered immediately. How are you holding up? I've had better weeks. I need your help with something. Name it. I want to set up a foundation, a nonprofit specifically focused on helping homeless and at-risk youth. Housing, education, job training, mental health services, all of it. I want to fund it properly, with enough money that we can actually make a difference. What do I need to do? There was a pause. Then, Richard said you'd do something like this. He was right. Give me a week to draw up proposals. We'll need to work out the legal structure, the funding mechanisms, the governance. But we can do this. How much will it cost? To set up? Maybe $50,000 in legal and administrative costs. To fund properly? That depends on scale. What are you thinking? I thought about the kids I worked with, the waiting lists for beds in shelters, the teenagers aging out of foster care with nowhere to go, the young people cycling through emergency rooms and jails because there was no long-term support available, the kids who wanted to go to school or get jobs but couldn't because they were worried about where they'd sleep that night. Big, I said. I want to think big. Start in this city, but with plans to expand. Housing programs, educational scholarships, job placement services, mental health support, everything kids need to actually have a chance. You're talking about a major initiative, tens of millions of dollars in the long term. I have $52 million that I don't need. Let's use it. All right then, we'll make it happen. But Jordan, you need to take care of legal protection first. The family is going to contest the will. Ryan has already filed preliminary papers. You need to be prepared for a fight. What are our chances? Of winning? Probably 99%. Richard was meticulous, but the process will be expensive and stressful. They're hoping you'll settle just to make it go away. I'm not settling. Good. Neither is Richard's estate. We'll fight this as long as it takes. Over the next few weeks, I learned more about money and law and family dynamics than I'd ever wanted to know. Ryan's legal challenge was based on claims of undue influence, that I'd manipulated Uncle Richard into changing his will. Victoria joined the challenge with claims that Richard had been mentally incompetent. Marcus filed separately with claims that the will violated some obscure legal principle about distribution among heirs. Patricia demolished all of them. She presented the psychiatric evaluations. She presented the journals showing my daily visits were about companionship, not manipulation. She presented testimony from hospital staff about my behavior versus the behavior of other family members. She presented video evidence from the hospital showing me reading to Uncle Richard, talking with him, never once discussing his will or his money. The judge wasn't impressed with the family's case. "What I see here," she said during one hearing I was forced to attend, "is a group of relatives who largely neglected a dying man and who are now upset that their neglect has consequences." Mr. Morrison was clearly of sound mind. He made his wishes explicitly clear, and nothing presented suggests that his nephew Jordan engaged in any manipulation or improper behavior. This case is dismissed. Ryan tried to appeal. The appeals court refused to hear it. By month 3, the legal challenges were over. The will stood. The money was officially irrevocably mine, and I started using it. The Jordan Morrison Foundation, named that way at Patricia's insistence despite my protests that it felt egotistical, launched 6 months after Uncle Richard's death. We'd spent that time doing everything right. Proper legal structure, experienced board of directors, clear mission and values, partnerships with existing organizations that were already doing good work. The Foundation's mission was simple: provide comprehensive support to homeless and at-risk youth. We weren't trying to fix everything. That was impossible. But we could make a real difference for the kids who came through our programs. We started by purchasing a building, an old hotel downtown that had been sitting vacant for years. 35 rooms, communal kitchen, common areas. We renovated it into a youth shelter and support center. Private rooms instead of the dormitory-style bunks most shelters used, because kids who'd experienced trauma needed safety and privacy. Full-time staff including social workers, nurses, counselors, and case managers. Educational support including tutoring and help with GED programs. Job training and placement services, mental health care, medical care. Everything kids needed to actually stabilize their lives. We called it Morrison House, over my continued protests. "You need to get used to your name being on things," Patricia had said. "That's how philanthropy works. People remember who helps them." The foundation also funded scholarships, full ride to community college or trade school for any kid who completed our program and wanted to continue their education. We partnered with local businesses to create job pipelines. We hired formerly homeless youth as peer counselors and mentors. I left my job at the nonprofit. There wasn't time to do both, and frankly, I could accomplish more through the foundation than I ever could working 60 hours a week for $45,000 a year. But I made sure we worked closely with my former organization, funding their programs, referring clients, collaborating on services. The first kid who came through Morrison House was named Alex, 17, kicked out by parents who couldn't handle that he was trans, living on the streets for 3 months. He'd been on the waiting list at every shelter in the city. He'd been sleeping in parks, under bridges, in the doorways of closed businesses, anywhere he could find a relatively safe spot to close his eyes for a few hours without being attacked or arrested. He'd been assaulted twice, once by a group of drunk college kids who thought harassing a homeless person was entertainment, once by another homeless person trying to steal his backpack. He'd been robbed 3 times, losing what little he'd had, a phone his ex-girlfriend had given him before his parents kicked him out, $70 he'd been saving for bus fare, a jacket that had been his only real protection against the weather. He'd contracted pneumonia from exposure, his lungs filling with fluid after sleeping in the rain for 3 consecutive nights with nowhere dry to go, and ended up in the ER barely conscious, burning with fever, coughing blood. That's how he'd gotten connected with our program. The hospital social worker had called us because Alex was about to be discharged and had nowhere to go, and every other shelter in the city was full or had waiting lists months long. When I showed him to his room at Morrison House, a small private space, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, but with a real bed with clean sheets, a desk where he could study or draw, a dresser for clothes he didn't have yet, a window overlooking the street below, he just stood there in the doorway staring for a long moment, not moving, barely breathing. His backpack was still on his shoulders, like he expected to be told this was a joke, that he'd have to leave, that there was some mistake. Then he'd taken one tentative step inside, then another. Then he'd walked to the window and looked out at the street, at the city he'd been wandering through for 3 months with no safe place to stop. He'd turned to me and said, his voice cracking with emotion he was clearly trying to hold back, "This is mine? Just mine? I don't have to share it with anybody?" "It's yours as long as you need it. Your name is on the door. You have the only key. This is your space, your safe place. No one comes in without your permission." He'd started crying then, silent tears running down his face, his whole body shaking with the force of emotions he'd clearly been suppressing for months. I'd stood there awkwardly, not sure what to do, wanting to help but not wanting to invade his space, not wanting to make assumptions about what he needed. Finally, he'd wiped his eyes roughly with the back of his hand and said, "Sorry, I'm just I haven't had my own room in so long. Since before I transitioned, since before I told my parents and everything fell apart, I forgot what it felt like to have a door I could close, to have privacy, to have somewhere that was mine, where I could just exist without constantly watching my back, without wondering if someone was going to hurt me or steal from me or tell me I didn't belong there. That's when I knew, really knew, deep in my bones, that Uncle Richard had been right. This was what the money was for. Not buying expensive cars or bigger houses or accumulating more wealth just to have it sit in accounts earning interest, but for giving kids like Alex a door they could close. A space that was theirs. A chance to stop just surviving and start actually living. A chance to rebuild their lives on a foundation of safety and dignity, rather than on the shifting sand of constant crisis. Alex wasn't our only success story, though he was the first, and would always hold a special place in my heart because of that. There was Maria, 15, who'd run away from a foster home where she'd been sexually abused by the foster father, who'd been living on the streets for 8 months and working as a prostitute just to eat, who came to us angry and distrustful and convinced that all adults were either abusers or people who'd let abuse happen. She'd tested us constantly those first few months, breaking rules, getting into fights with other residents, stealing from the kitchen, anything to see if we'd give up on her like everyone else had. But we didn't give up. We set boundaries, sure, but we didn't kick her out. We kept showing up, kept being consistent, kept treating her like she mattered. And slowly, so slowly, she'd started to believe that maybe she did matter. Maybe she deserved safety and kindness. Maybe not all adults were terrible. She was 20 now, 3 years after leaving Morrison House, working as a medical assistant and taking classes to become a nurse. She came back regularly to volunteer, to talk to new residents about how the program had saved her life. There was Deshawn, 16, whose mother had died of cancer and whose father was in prison, who'd been bouncing between relatives who didn't want him, who'd ended up on the streets after his aunt decided she couldn't afford another mouth to feed. Deshawn had been one of the quietest kids I'd ever met. He'd barely speak during his first month, just nodding or shaking his head in response to questions, keeping his eyes down, trying to be as invisible as possible. It had taken our counselor 6 weeks to get him to open up about the grief he was carrying, about watching his mother die slowly over 2 years while his father sat in a cell unable to say goodbye, about feeling like he didn't belong anywhere, about the crushing loneliness of being 16 and completely alone in the world. But once he'd started talking, once he'd realized he was in a place where people actually listened, where his pain was taken seriously, where adults showed up consistently and didn't disappear, he'd started to heal. He was in community college now, studying engineering, living in one of our transitional apartments with 2 other former residents, building a life he'd never imagined was possible. There was Jasmine, 17, who'd aged out of foster care with no family support and no place to go, who'd been couch surfing with friends until the friends got tired of her and she'd ended up in a shelter where she'd been assaulted by a staff member who thought homeless girls were easy targets. There was Carlos, 15, whose parents had been deported and who'd been left behind because he'd been born in the U.S. and was therefore a citizen, who'd been staying with friends of the family until ICE had started asking questions and everyone had gotten scared and told him he had to leave. There was Amber, 16, whose parents were both addicts who'd chosen drugs over housing, who'd been living in the family car until the car got repossessed, who'd been trying to go to school while living on the streets because she'd been determined not to let her circumstances destroy her future. Each of them had a story. Each of them had experienced trauma that would have broken most adults. Each of them had survived things that shouldn't happen to anyone, let alone to kids. And each of them had come through Morrison House, had been given a safe place and support, and the resources they needed to actually stabilize their lives, had been treated with dignity and respect, had been given a chance. In the first year, Morrison House served 83 kids. We had a 73% success rate. Kids who moved into stable housing, went back to school or got their GED, got jobs, reconnected with families when that was safe, or aged into adult services with support systems in place instead of falling through the cracks. That might not sound impressive to people who don't understand this work, who think 73% means we failed 27% of the kids who came through. But in a system where most programs have 30 to 40% success rates at best, where kids cycle through services repeatedly with no lasting change, where the same young people show up at emergency rooms and jails and morgues over and over because there's no effective intervention, 73% was extraordinary. It was revolutionary. It was proof that when you actually invest in young people, when you give them comprehensive support rather than piecemeal services, when you treat them as human beings with potential rather than as problems to be managed, they can thrive. In the second year, we opened a second location, and we expanded services to include employment programs, a social enterprise that hired homeless youth to learn job skills while earning income, commercial cleaning, landscaping, food service, real jobs with real pay and real training. In the third year, we started a housing program, transitional apartments for young people who'd stabilized enough to live independently but still needed support, subsidized rent, case management, ongoing counseling, a bridge between the shelter and full independence. The foundation grew, the staff grew, the programs grew, and the number of kids we helped grew. Meanwhile, the family remained angry. Ryan had cut off all contact. Victoria sent occasional passive-aggressive messages about how nice it must be to have money to throw around while her children's college funds remained underfunded. Never mind that her children's college funds were underfunded because she and Preston had spent $150,000 renovating their kitchen. Marcus spread rumors that I'd stolen the money, that I'd forged the will, that the whole thing was a scam. I stopped caring. I was too busy actually helping people to worry about what they thought of me. My mother came to the Morrison House opening. She didn't say much, just toured the facility, watched me talk with kids, observed how the programs worked. When we were leaving, she said quietly, "Your uncle was right about you. You are the best of us. I'm just trying to help." That's what makes you the best of us. The rest of us spend our lives trying to get more. You spend your life trying to give more. Richard saw that. That's why he chose you. Emma visited regularly. She'd started volunteering at Morrison House on weekends, helping with the peer mentoring program. She got it in a way most people didn't, understood that these kids didn't need saving, they needed support, didn't need pity, they needed resources, didn't need judgment, they needed a chance. 3 years after Uncle Richard's death, I was sitting in my office at Morrison House. I'd gotten an office, though I still spent most of my time on the floor working with kids and staff, when Alex stopped by. He wasn't a resident anymore. He'd transitioned to one of our independent living apartments, gotten his GED, started community college studying social work, but he still came by regularly to volunteer and mentor new residents. "Hey, Jordan, got a minute?" "For you? Always." He sat down, fidgeting with his phone. "I wanted to tell you something. I got accepted to State University, full scholarship to their social work program. I start in the fall." "Alex, that's amazing. Congratulations." "Yeah, it's pretty cool. But I wanted to tell you because 3 years ago I was living under a bridge. 3 years ago I'd given up. I thought I was going to end up dead or in prison or just gone. And then I ended up here, and you guys gave me a chance, and now I'm going to college and I'm going to do what you do. I'm going to help kids like me, and I just wanted to say thank you for that, for seeing me as a person who deserved help instead of as a problem to be managed." I felt my eyes getting wet. "You did the work, Alex. You're the one who rebuilt your life." "Yeah, but you gave me the tools to do it. You gave me a safe place to sleep and food to eat and people who gave a shit. You can't rebuild your life when you're just trying to survive. You gave me the space to be more than just survival." After he left, I pulled out Uncle Richard's letter and read it again for probably the 100th time since his death. Use this money to do something that would make me proud, too. I thought about Alex, about the 83 kids in year 1, about the hundreds of kids we'd helped in the years since, about the lives changed, the futures created, the possibilities opened. Yeah, Uncle Richard. I think I'm doing that.